Hello, class. So we are moving right along to chapter 30 now. We are going to talk about our seed plants. We talked about our non-vascular plants, things like mosses. We talked about vascular seedless plants, things like ferns. And now most of the plants, when you think of a plant, it's probably a vascular seed plant. So that's where we are in chapter 30. So just a little fun story to start out. When my parents were expecting me, they were living in Washington State. They were about 2 hours north of Mount St. Helens, which is a volcano, and the volcano erupted. And when it erupted, it was ash, it was lava, just no respect for life or anything, just killed as it came. That ash landed, and it was pretty barren for a while. But within a couple of years, there were plants growing there again. One of those plants is called fireweed, this beautiful pink plant here. It colonized within a couple of years. It colonized, started growing on that barren volcano. One example of seed plants' versatility. They saw this, not saw, but there was this barren landscape, and the plants had no problem spreading their seeds and producing. Here's what a firewood seed looks like. You might be able to look at that and figure out how could that have gotten to the volcano. It would have had to travel from a plant to get to the volcano. How would it have gotten there? If you look at that seed, it kind of helps you figure out how seed plants are able to be so versatile and so successful at colonizing land. When we talk about a seed, we've already defined this, but let's review again. It is an embryo. It is going to be specifically a sporophyte embryo. And nutrients, so there's a nice food supply here. That food supply feeds the embryo until it is able to start growing and producing things like leaves to do photosynthesis. And it also has a seed coat. And that seed coat is really good at protecting that seed from, very cold weather, from drying out, desiccation, from radiation. It really helps protect that seed over a lot of things. And seeds can actually stay dormant for even years at a time. Another thing that's nice about seeds to allow plants to colonize land is that they can disperse over long distances. They can be spread by the wind. If you review that fireweed seed that we just looked at, it could be carried through the wind, from a plant that's outside the blast zone. That seed is traveled into the blast zone. It could also be carried attached to an animal's fur, or traveling through an animal's digestive system, and then be laid and develop and germinate into a plant. All seed plants have reduced gametophytes. That means their gametophytes are microscopic, and they actually are going to be contained within the cones or the flowers of our seed plants. They are heterosporous. That means they have different types of spores that will go on to produce male gametophytes or female gametophytes to produce either pollen or ovules. And they also have ovules and pollen. So all these adaptations help plants deal with drought. They no longer have to stay in the water. They can be fertilized outside of water. The seed can survive drought or very dry conditions. They can survive ultraviolet radiation, and they no longer require water for fertilization. So seed plant life cycles are sporophyte dominant. So this is where we talked about with our bryophytes. This is where we were with our seedless vascular plants, and here we are today with our seed plants. They are sporophyte dominant. That means when you look at a tree, you look at a flower, this is the sporophyte generation. The gametophytes are microscopic and dependent. Here in a gymnosperm, which would be something like a conifer, the gametophytes are inside of the cones. Here in an angiosperm, something like a flower, the gametophytes are inside parts of the flowers. The gametophytes develop from spores that are retained within the sporangia of the sporophyte. So instead of the spores being released to grow up into a gametophyte, the spores are retained. They're kept inside of the gametophyte. I'm sorry, they're retained inside the sporophyte. So that helps protect the gametophytes. They're protected from the environment. They also are able to receive nutrients from that parent sporophyte. Seed plants are all heterosporous. That means they have two types of spores, and those spores are going to develop into either male gametophytes or female gametophytes to produce either pollen if they are male gametophytes or to produce ovules if they are female gametophytes. All seed plants are heterosporous. We discussed homosporous plants when we talked about our ferns. All seed plants, everything in this chapter, will be heterosporous. The spores will develop Spores will develop within the sporangia on these modified leaves called sporophylls. And megasporophylls will produce megasporangia, which produce megaspores that turn into female gametophytes. Microsporophylls will produce microsporangia that produce microspores that produce male gametophytes. So megaspores are going to produce ovules, and microspores are going to produce pollen. Around the outside of a cell, there's a layer of sporophyte tissue called integument. That is what this outer covering is. And that will protect and surround this megasporangium. On a gymnosperm, we typically have one integument, and in angiosperms, we'll typically have two of them. So the megasporangium, the megaspore, and the integument makes an ovule. This whole thing here. You have the megasporangium, the megaspore, and the integument. Each microspore will develop into a pollen grain, and that pollen grain will have the male gametophyte enclosed within the pollen. And pollination is when pollen travels from one seed plant to another part of the plant containing the ovules, whether it is going onto the same plant or to a different plant, depending on what type of plant we're talking about. Pollen can be transferred long distances, carried by the wind, like we just talked about with our fire plant, carried by animals. So you no longer need the water to transfer the sperm because the pollen is able to be carried without the water. Pollen grains germinate when they reach the female reproductive structure, and a germinated pollen grain produces a pollen tube, and the pollen tube grows into the ovule and will bring the sperm into the female gametophyte. So seeds are multicellular, but the spores are still single cells. The seeds can remain dormant for years until conditions are favorable for germination. Spores are going to be shorter lived. Seeds have stored food to nourish growing seedlings, and spores do not give nourishment to gametophytes. Seeds can be transported longer distances by wind or animals. Spores usually drop closer to the parent plant. So instead of relying on spores to be traveling, being able to have seeds as what is going to spread out your plant allows for a lot of evolutionary advantages here. Okay, before we come to this part, I'm going to pause, and we are going to finish by watching this video clip.
From ovule to seed in a gymnosperm. The adaptive advantages of seed production have allowed seed plants to become the dominant producers on land. This figure explains how a seed develops in one group of seed plants called gymnosperms, using a pine as an example. The story of how a seed develops begins with an unfertilized ovule. In pines and most other gymnosperms, the unfertilized ovules are housed in structures called ovulate cones. A cross-section through an immature ovulate cone is shown in the upper left part of this diagram. Each ovulate cone contains numerous ovules, which can develop into seeds if fertilized. Zooming in on a cross-section through one ovule, we can see that it consists of three main parts: an integument, which envelops and protects a megasporangium, which surrounds the megaspore. The megaspore is enclosed in a spore wall. Recall that all plants have a life cycle in which a diploid sporophyte generation alternates with a haploid gametophyte generation. In seed plants, the sporophyte is the generation that's visible to the naked eye, in this case, the tree. The integument and the megasporangium are part of the sporophyte, so both are diploid, signified by 2N. The megasporangium produces the megaspore through meiosis, so the megaspore is haploid, signified by N. The fertilization of an ovule begins with pollination, when a pollen grain enters the ovule through a small opening called the micropyle. The pollen grain contains the male gametophyte, which is haploid. The purple dot inside the pollen grain represents a sperm nucleus. Once a pollen grain has entered through the micropyle, several events occur before fertilization happens. First, the pollen grain produces a pollen tube that begins growing through the megasporangium. This process is referred to as the germination of a pollen grain. At the same time, the megaspore develops into a female gametophyte. What is the ploidy of the female gametophyte? Like the male gametophyte in the pollen grain, the female gametophyte in the ovule is haploid. The male gametophyte produces sperm, and the female gametophyte produces an egg. When the pollen tube reaches the female gametophyte, sperm are discharged from the tube into the female gametophyte. Fertilization occurs when the haploid egg nucleus unites with a haploid sperm nucleus, resulting in a fertilized ovule. Fertilization produces a diploid zygote, which undergoes mitosis, resulting in a diploid embryo. As the embryo develops, the ovule is transformed into a seed. The female gametophyte becomes a food supply for the embryo. The megasporangium shrinks, leaving a remnant that surrounds the spore wall. And the integument becomes a protective seed coat. All of these parts, seed coat, spore wall, food supply, and embryo, make up the seed. Notice that the seed includes 3 generations of the plant life cycle. The seed coat contains diploid tissues from the sporophyte, the pine tree in this case. The food supply is derived from female gametophyte tissue, which is haploid, and the embryo, which carries genetic information from the egg and the sperm, is diploid. As such, the embryo represents a new sporophyte generation.
Okay, I will see you back for our next part of our chapter discussion where we'll start talking about what our gymnospores are. See you soon. Bye.